you all for coming today. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Steve Hromada. Steve comes to us from Drexel University in Philadelphia. I think he was originally an engineering undergraduate before switching over to biology. After he graduated Drexel, he went down to work in Georgia for the Jones Center for Ecological Research, where he studied invasive fire ants. After that, he went to work out in Las Vegas, Nevada, working for the Great Basin Institute, and there he worked on desert tortoises, so he's had a pretty broad variety of field experiences. As an undergraduate, he also was in Equatorial Guinea, Africa, working with frog communities, so Steve's been around. And he's going to continue some of that and talk to you today about some continuation of some stuff he was interested in earlier with frog communities. He's going to talk to us today about amphibians and reptiles, and the title of his talk is Response of Reptile and Amphibian Communities to Prescribed Fire in a Fire-Suppressed Oak Hickory Forest.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction, Chris, and thank you to all of you for coming. Please eat the donuts. I don't want to. I'm going to start off by acknowledging everyone who made this project possible, all the members of my lab, including my advisor. They collected a lot of this data before I came, and additionally helped me collect the data while I was here. Our collaborators in the Forest Service who helped provide the necessary resources to get this project done and provided useful comments on the manuscript. My committee, of course, and of course all the volunteers and technicians who have helped collect the data for this project over the years. So just a quick outline. We're going to start today with the introduction, of course, the importance of fire and how fire and herpetofauna kind of interact and why we're interested in these things. So fire is an important disturbance in many of our ecosystems. Historically, we had many fires on these landscapes, we believe. These fires were helped to maintain the open habitats, they impeded succession, and historically we saw these fires being started by natural causes such as lightning strikes and other causes such as Native Americans burning the land for their own purposes. Unfortunately, here we go. Here's the natural fire regimes of the U.S. We know quite a lot about this now. It's been an active field of research for many decades. As you see, most of the southeast and the east are pretty burning on mean intervals pretty consistently. Of course, I want to draw your attention to where this study takes place here in western Kentucky, where we see a mean fire return interval between 4 and 8 years. So that means all the different systems in this area were receiving fire on those mean interval rates. So some systems, such as bottomland hardwood forest, would be receiving fire much less in the upland areas of the savanna and grassland. Of course, our nation has been under we had a fire suppression policy, especially in our national forests, until the 1960s. Smokey the Bear kind of typifies that with only you prevent forest fires. We kind of realized that this was causing succession into these closed mesic systems and changing our biodiversity available. And so now Smokey the Bear is all about preventing wildfires and not just fires in general. We've come to realize that prescribed fire is important for many of these systems. So here we kind of this is a paper that kind of talks about the demise of fire and mesification of the forests of the eastern U.S., and we have some nice diagrams that kind of typify and explain what's going on here. So here we have, this is for the xeric uplands, so that's really what we're concerned about in our systems here. Kind of imagine this ball is kind of showing you where the ecosystem state is, and these cups are kind of like a somewhat stable state. So these stable states are maintained by different fire regimes. So if you're getting many fires hitting that system, you're going to maintain an oak savanna, a little bit less fire into a woodland, and a little bit less fire into a forest. That prevents this ecosystem state from falling into what we call the mesophytic hardwood state. However, without fire down here, what we see is that ball kind of cascades and falls down into this mesophytic hardwood state, and it's much harder to recover that ball out into these oak forest, oak woodland, oak savanna systems that we kind of used to have in many of these areas. So another diagram from this paper, kind of just showing you how the structure changes with the lack of fire. So it changed from a fire importance. So we see red down here, and it kind of changes to this blue when the fire becomes less important to maintaining that state of that ecosystem. So what we see here is we have these pyrophilic trees such as oaks and pines kind of dominating the canopy, yet there's a lot of sunlight reaching the bottom, so we have lots of grass and foregrowth. With fire suppression, we get canopy closure, which increases shade to the bottom, and this causes a dramatic increase of shade-tolerant mesophytic trees, so things like maple and sweet gum, things that would get eaten up in a fire, yet without the fire, they're able to kind of prosper in the shade and grow. Their leaf litter is a lot different than the leaf litter we expect from things like oaks, so that increases what they call the mesicness of the litter, causing it be much harder to implement fire on these systems. And this will cause succession into closed canopy forests of those systems, which has implications for a lot of the biodiversity we care about in this country. So here I have a bunch of species that kind of depend on these disturbance-dependent ecosystems. So some of these, such as the flatwood salamander and the Carter blue butterfly, are federally listed. Some of these are just state listed, such as the pine snake and the barred rattlesnake root. And some of these are just common species, such as the bobwhite quail and the fox squirrel, that we have seen declines with across their range due to loss of these open habitats. So these are species that people kind of used to expect to see when they go out on a walk in the woods, and now they're becoming harder and harder to find, and have obviously attracted some regulatory attention. So, of course, today we're concerned with, in this talk, reptiles and amphibians. These are two major papers that are cited quite a bit that go into the dramatic loss of populations and species in both these groups. I'm going to just bring out the major point from the reptile paper. Reptile species are declining on a global scale. Significant threats to populations are habitat loss and degradation. So these guys recognize that this was perhaps the most important factor leading to the decline and loss of many of our reptile populations. And we could consider the loss of fire on these landscapes a form of habitat degradation. So what do? We use prescribed fire. It's a land management tool that landowners such as the Forest Service, the state, use to reduce fuel loads, to reduce the danger of potential wildfires, to mimic these natural disturbance regimes, and to maintain and restore these open habitat structures that we desire for our biodiversity. Fires are usually set either by like a drip torch like here, or they're also set by aerial ignition. So when we are concerned, so when people hear about fire in the forest, they're concerned about how is this affecting the animals. First thing people jump to is, oh my God, it's going to kill all the cute little animals. However, we believe that direct mortality from fire is relatively rare with herpetofauna. Many animals like the spade-foot toad here are adapted to living in these fire-prone ecosystems, so they know either to get away from the fire by going underground or just to run away from the front of the fire. And you can hear stories of people who do these prescribed fires finding snakes that are escaping the fire, or snakes that are basking out in the fire right afterwards. In animals, even animals such as this box turtle, which is from our study site, we found him 6 years after the last fire. Even with all this carapace damage there, he seemed to be a healthy weight and living his life out as he see fit in potentially better habitat. So overall, these are believed, the direct mortality effects are believed to have low population level impacts. However, the habitat changes is what we're more concerned about, and we know that these can cause herpetofaunal community responses. Some taxa show positive responses, so a big example of that is lizards. So this is the six-line race runner. It's basically a prairie open grassland species. It's been shown to be an indicator of systems that are burned on a regular basis. They have more thermal opportunities, more opportunities to run around the litter and find the food they want. Animals such as puffidonid salamanders, such as the slimy salamander here, have been shown to decline in some systems, and that's believed to be due to systems that are burned. Believed to be because of the lack of the reduction of their preferred moist, humid microclimates, such as leaf litter and, of course, woody debris. Some show a kind of mixed response. So this is an example of a leaf litter snake. So these are small-bodied snakes that inhabit the forest floor. Some studies have shown certain species of these decrease when fire and other land management is applied, while some have shown that some of these species increase. So it's in a kind of a mixed bag for this group of species. And some species show relatively no response to these land management techniques. So this is an example of a pond-breeding amphibian. They seem to be more tied to having high-quality breeding habitats, so ponds, creeks, and other wetlands, than they are to the characteristics of the upland habitat around their breeding habitats. So the goals of the study were to determine the impact of a prescribed fire on reptile and amphibian communities in an oak hickory forest. And we wanted to relate these potential changes in these community structures to habitat structural changes. So we want to kind of say, this fire is impacting this community, and this is why. So we're going to talk about our methods and goals, our study site, of course, where this study took place is pretty important to understanding what we were trying to do. We'll talk about the treatments that were applied and the experimental units we had within those treatments, and we're going to talk about how we sampled both the herpetofaunal communities and the vegetational structure. So our study site is Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area. It's a large recreation area located in western Kentucky and Tennessee. Historically, LBL was dominated by an oak savanna woodland matrix. There's few examples of this left in LBL now. One kind of example is our elk and bison prairie, which is more of a tourist attraction. And unfortunately, much of the elk and bison prairie was planted in non-native grasses, but it still offers us an opportunity to kind of see what the structure of those habitats would have looked like. So we see much less of a canopy closure, we see a lot of grass and foregrowth. However, fire suppression has caused succession into a closed canopy oak hickory forest. This is a shot from one of the fire towers at LBL. As far as the eye can see, it's a pretty dense canopy. So what we're seeing is a loss of habitat heterogeneity and unique habitat types that used to exist here. The Forest Service has recognized this through the declines of certain species such as the quail, the meadowlark, and the pine snake, and restoration efforts have been implemented and are ongoing to restore more of an open oak savanna grassland. LBL is pretty important when we look at it for reptile conservation, so I have up here 7 species of conservation concern or higher in Kentucky: the southeastern 5-lined skink, scarlet king snake, 6-lined race runner, the scarlet snake, pygmy rattlesnake, southeastern crown snake, and the pine snake. Most of these species only extend partially into their range along the Tennessee River drainage up into LBL. So this offers us an opportunity for these species to exist on a federally managed land when there's few other opportunities for them in the state. Many of these species are highly associated with open habitats that would have historically been maintained by fire, and that potentially is a factor in why these species have seen declines in these areas. So to study these impacts on the reptile and amphibian communities, we established 8 plots in 2010. This red area here signifies this 1,000-hectare Franklin Creek burn site. The Forest Service applied prescribed fire here in 2007 and 2010. Fires were started via aerial ignition, so they had helicopters come in and drop polystyrene balls on the ridge tops, and the fires were kind of a mosaic of different fire impacts on the actual system over a big landscape. The control sites over here were managed similarly, so there was no real logging or any other activities within our plots. So these were managed similarly without the application of fire, so they're basically just left to sit. As you see here, our site is located in the northern part of LBL. The elk and bison prairie is actually right here, and the big 6880 highway is about here, if you guys are looking to see what an oak grassland demonstration area looks like. To sample herpetofauna, we used a drift fence. So a drift fence is basically a large fence in the middle of the forest. We had 100-meter drift fence located in each of these plots. An animal crawls along the ground, hits the drift fence, and can't get over it, so it follows along the fence, and then it either falls into one of our buckets or one of our box traps. So the box traps are basically a funnel. The animal gets in there, he falls down, he can't get himself out. The buckets are 5-gallon buckets sunk into the ground. Animals get into those and can't get themselves out. And we would also sample animals that we found along the fences. We also additionally established some coverboard lines in 2016, just as an additional way to kind of back up our other data. They were basically located haphazardly along the paths we took to the drift fence and checked concurrently with the drift fence. Every animal we caught was marked, so we didn't run the risk of double counting. Snakes were marked by a scale clip on their ventral side. Larger snakes were given a pit tag. Lizards and amphibians were marked via toe clippings, and turtles were marked via marginal scoop notching. To sample the available habitat and to kind of understand the vegetational structural changes, we performed multiple 100-meter transects within each of those study plots. We measured tree density, so we used a proxy for density. We used overstory tree distance and understory tree distance, so we basically stop at a point along our transect. We did 6 points per transect, and we would measure how far we are to the closest understory tree and how far we are to the closest overstory tree, and that gives us an idea of an easy way to measure the tree density for those areas. We also measured percent canopy cover with densitometer, litter depth, And we use a Dobmeyer frame to quantify ground cover composition. So here we have a Dobmeyer frame placed in LBL, and we can see we have a beautiful cover of poison ivy. So a timeline just to kind of bring it together of what we did. In 2007, the Forest Service applied the first prescribed fire. 2010, we did the first vegetation sampling, the deer fences were installed, and the second prescribed fire occurred. In 2007, herpetofaunal sampling began in earnest, and we saw more vegetation sampling. We repeated this sampling scheme in 2012, 2015, and 2016. In 2013 and 14, we did some minor herpetofaunal sampling, but nothing robust enough to be analyzed using these statistical methods. So, first I'm going to talk to you guys about how the vegetational structure changed between our burned and our control sites. This is obviously important if we're looking at how the biological communities are going to be impacted. So here I have some pictures. These were taken in 2016 in both our burn and control sites on the same day. What we see here in our burn site is that much more sunlight is reaching the ground. We see a lot more grass and forb growth and a lot more sapling growth. So this is allowing more recruitment, and the whole idea behind part of these fires was to allow oak recruitment. So we're seeing there's a structural change there when we compare it to this closed canopy control site, which has barely any sunlight reaching the ground, not as much grass and forb growth, and a lot more litter cover. When we look at the hard numbers, we see a similar trend. So I got one of you guys used to seeing the burn as the dark one, the control as the light one. That's going to be something we hold standard kind of through this whole talk. What we see here is that our control canopy cover is higher than our burn canopy cover. Unfortunately, we can't really say that we've reached an oak woodland or an oak savanna, as we did not reduce the canopy cover down to these lower numbers, which are indicative of those states. When we look at our overstory tree distance and understory tree distance, we see that generally in our burn sites, trees are farther apart. This kind of held true in our burn sites even 5 and 6 years after, but when we look at understory tree, we see that those differences are becoming much less stark 5 and 6 years after the last fire was applied. That suggests that some of these changes are not going to keep being changed if you don't consistently reapply fire. And then we see litter depth, which is another important microhabitat characteristic for many animals. We see that's generally higher in our control site than our burn site. And then when we look at so these are our 4 most common ground cover characteristics. So we looked at litter cover, so how much of the percentage of the forest floor is covered by leaf litter. And what we see is, as we would expect, it's generally higher in our control sites than our burn sites. And now what we see that our burn sites as burning has definitely benefited is grass and forb coverage. So we see that grass and forb coverage are higher in our burn sites than our control sites, which is something that we kind of expect and are hoping to get from applying these burns. We also see a similar trend for woody coverage. So this is saplings and shrubs and other things that are coming up due to the more open habitat and enhanced opportunities for them. Another thing we're often concerned about with herpetofauna especially is coarse woody debris. So this is logs and other large woody debris that are down on the forest floor, and we see relatively little difference between our burn and our control sites, which suggests that the burns aren't really impacting this important habitat component. So now I'm going to talk to you guys about some classical diversity metrics we looked at, and basically how many animals we caught and what we're kind of working with. So we caught a lot of animals, 2,456 reptiles of 27 different species, and 7,108 amphibians of 22 different species. Some of these animals are pretty cool and exciting to find, like the eastern spadefoot toad, the scarlet king snake, and the red salamander, but the majority of these animals were common species that one finds pretty often. So the diversity metrics we used to kind of look at this response, we first looked at observed richness. How many species are we seeing? This is just the raw count of how many species did we catch in that trap in a year. We also looked at estimated richness. Now we know when we're using these passive sampling techniques, and really any sampling technique, we're going to miss some of those rare species. So we use Chow2, which is a sample-based estimator that takes into account how many rare species we found in a trap that year, and it kind of extrapolates and estimates how many rare species we were missing and gives us an estimation of how many species were actually on the landscape. And we also looked at species diversity. We used the Shannon exponential, which is just the exponential of your common Shannon-Wiener diversity index. We tested this with a generalized linear mixed model. We had treatment and year as our fixed characters, and site as a random, which allows us to kind of do a repeated measure since we're using the same traps year after year. So when we look at our observed richness for reptiles, we see that it's generally higher in our treatment of burn than control, and we saw a significant effect in treatment for that statistic. This suggests that we're catching more reptile species in our burn sites than our control sites. When we look at estimated richness for reptiles, however, we see no significant effect of treatment, and that kind of suggests that it is really important to take into account these potentially unseen species when we're looking at these sorts of metrics. When we look at reptile diversity, we see that there was a difference between treatment, and that was mostly driven by lower diversities found in our control sites in 2015 and 16. This could be due to just natural community fluctuations or something else that we could not quite account for. When we look at those same metrics for amphibians, we see no significant effect of treatment for observed richness in amphibians and estimated richness in amphibians. It trended to be higher in the controls and our burns, but it wasn't anything that we would call statistically significant. When we look at our amphibian diversity, we see a similar trend, no significant effect of treatment, which suggests to us that these metrics are not being impacted by this management scheme, except for potentially reptile diversity. Now I'm going to talk about the community structural changes. So even if we're not losing species or the diversity metric, we are concerned with how these changes in the habitat are affecting the community composition. So is one species becoming more dominant, and which species might be that be, or things like that that we can look at with other methods. So to do this, we use non-metric dimensional scaling. This is an ordination technique. It basically places sites that are closer together if they're more similar, and sites that are farther apart are more dissimilar. So we have our burn sites are these dark boxes, or dark dots, and these control sites are our open blocks. And what we see is that most of our burn sites are clustering over here, so that kind of tells us that these burn sites are more similar to each other than they are to most of our control sites, which are more to the right side of the ordination here. Now what we can do with this is we can overlay it with the correlations of the habitat characteristics. So we use a permutation test to find which habitat characteristics were statistically correlated with our ordination, and what we found is that grass, woody, and less understory tree were correlated with the left side of our ordination, and that litter was correlated with the right side of our ordination. Now this suggests that these factors may be playing a role in the structuring of these communities. This is not too surprising, as more grass and woody growth and less understory tree growth are kind of indicative of our burn sites over here, and litter is more indicative of our control sites over here. We can also overlay what we call the species optimum. So this kind of is based on the ordination. It extrapolates where these species would be at their highest percent composition of the communities. So what we see here is pretty interesting. Many of our snake species, so these are 4-letter codes, 2 letters of the genus, 2 letters of the species. And what we see is that many of our snake species are more clustered around these burn sites, while many of our lizards are more clustered around these control sites. This suggests that these species are reaching higher percents of the composition in those respective treatments. It's not necessarily a reflectance of higher abundance. We see these species down here, our timber rattlesnake, southeastern 5-line snake, and the scarlet snake. These were only ever captured in our burn sites, and what this is kind of saying is that if we had a community that was this dissimilar from all those communities, these species would reach their highest proportion of the community. Now what we can also do to test whether or not these communities became statistically different is we can overlay first the convex polygon that connects all 4 sites within a year, and then on top of that we can overlay 95% confidence intervals. So this kind of tells us that these communities are not completely overlapping and that there's some separation beginning to happen, but it has not happened yet. So this is the first year after the fire where we had our first major herpetofaunal sampling. When we look at 2012, it's kind of a little bit hard to see, but one lives here, one lives here, so we're still seeing some overlap with those ellipses, but it's much, it seems to be less than what we had the year before. When we look at 2015, we see pretty wide confidence interval ellipses, which is suggesting that maybe these, the sampling wasn't sufficient that year, and maybe these communities are starting to separate, But when we look at 2016, we see that there is the same similar pattern with the burn sites down here and the control sites over there, but that these overlaps between these ellipses are even more prevalent than they were in those earlier years, which suggests that these communities have not drastically diverged in their structure. Other studies have used this kind of analyses, and they've shown that these that communities will become more similar to each other if, especially to a reference site of the desired condition, if those treatments are consistently applied and we start seeing the shifts. So unfortunately, we don't have a reference Oak Savannah site data here, but I suspect it would probably be kind of over here, and it would be interesting to see how that would relate to what we found. When we look at amphibians, we don't see too much of a pattern here. And when we start overlaying the confidence interval ellipses, we see that generally the ellipses are overlapping each other pretty heavily within a year. So these are our first 2 years of sampling. We see that those confidence interval ellipse overlaps are pretty heavy. And when we see our second 2 years of sampling, we see the same thing, that within a year, these communities aren't differing a whole lot, but they are differing between years. And this isn't too surprising because amphibian communities are heavily driven by weather conditions, especially what we're going to be seeing moving around on a landscape. So different amounts of rainfall in different parts of the year, different amounts of temperature in different parts of the year can all affect the phenologies of these animals. We can also look at the species overlays on these, and what we see is that species that kind of dominated in certain years, like the toads dominating 2015, are much more prevalent in those areas. So, another thing we wanted to look at is how these microhabitat changes are affecting individual species. So for this, we use canonical correspondence analysis, which is like a weighted averaging way of kind of relating the species abundances to the habitat characteristics available on the landscape. So it's another ordination technique, and we use the same 4-letter species codes. And the way to kind of analyze this and interpret it is a species that is located far along the arrow for a habitat characteristic is highly dependent, or at least correlated with that habitat characteristic. So we have our eastern worm snake up here, pretty far along this coarse-woody debris, so you kind of look at it orthogonally. And so he's pretty correlated with coarse-woody debris as well as forb and grass growth. So that suggests that this species may reach its highest abundances where there's a lot of coarse-woody debris and forb and grass growth. So a condition that would be kind of typical of something that's burned often. We see down here, our Decay's brown snake seems to be pretty correlated with litter depth and woody growth and canopy cover, suggesting that this species may do best in more of a closed canopy system. Some interesting findings that kind of back up what other people have found is our little brown snake here correlated with litter depth. That's been found by other studies that have looked at a similar method. And many of our larger spotted snakes seem to kind of correlate with understory tree distance, overstory tree distance, and forb and grass growth, suggesting that these habitat characteristics may be driving the abundance changes we're seeing in these particular species. When we look at the same thing for amphibians, we find some other relationships. So when you see a species kind of located in the middle, that means that that any of our habitat characteristics we measured are likely not super important for that species. So ANSB stands for our two-toed species, and we kind of found that they didn't really correlate heavily with any of our measured habitat characteristics. Species such as our tree frog and our slimy salamanders seem to correlate heavily with understory distance and coarse-woody debris. That's kind of interesting for a tree frog, an animal you expect to be in trees, but other studies have shown a similar correlation, so that's pretty interesting. And we also see that some of these animals are kind of correlating more with the characteristics that we would find in our burn sites, which suggests that they may be doing just fine and enjoy those kind of, well, not enjoy, but benefit from those characteristics. Of course, these communities are multifaceted, as we just saw. Different species are going to have different responses to these treatments. So I'm going to go through a few examples of species that kind of seem to benefit in abundance from these treatments, and species that didn't benefit, and species that didn't really see much of a difference between our two treatments. We kind of measured this we determined this using a generalized linear mixed model once again, using the same factors that I showed you guys for the diversity metrics, and we added an offset to account for the different amount of sampling days that we did across the different years. So first species we're going to talk about is our ring-necked snake. So this is a small leaf litter snake, and we found, so it doesn't get longer than like 2-3 feet, and we found that it had a significant effective treatment with higher abundances in our burn. So what we see here is this is basically a catch per unit effort, so captures per 100 fence nights. This isn't exactly how we did the statistics, but it's a good way to visualize these differences. So this species was found higher in burns, and that's kind of an interesting finding for us, as most studies don't manage to catch the small litter snakes due to their targeting of larger bodied snakes. But our traps were able to catch quite a few of these animals, and another study that was able to catch quite a few of these animals basically showed that over a 15-year time passage of applying prescribed burns to a Florida sandhill system, this species basically disappears from the community. So another study in Kansas showed that this species reaches its highest abundances in tall grass prairie that's burned on a 5 to 6 year rotation, rather than one that's burned on a 2 to 3 year rotation, which suggests that this species may benefit from some disturbance, but that too much disturbance may be not super beneficial to the species, and we may see it kind of blink out of the community. This data was backed up by our coverboard data, so we saw much more of this species under coverboards in our burn sites than our control sites, which helps to suggest that what we're seeing is not just a difference in activity patterns of this animal. We also, our second most commonly captured snake was the black racer. This species that had a significant effect of treatment. Once again, other studies have shown that this species appears to benefit from more opening of the habitat structure, and a study on this species at our site showed that the habitat characteristics it prefers to spend its time in are more prevalent in our burn sites than our control sites. So that suggests that this species is benefiting from our application of burn treatments. This is an important species because it serves as a link between many different trophic levels of the food chain. It starts out small, eating small insects, and it gets pretty big, it starts eating small mammals, and it's eaten by many other predators, including other snakes, and including things like raptors and mesocarnivores. A species we saw little to no response with was our copperhead. We saw no significant effect of treatment, and what we saw here was that it seemed to have more in the control the first time, but this difference was not evident in years past, which suggests that these long-term studies are important to kind of understanding the actual impacts of a management scheme. Research on this animal at our study site has shown that the habitat characteristics may be better in our burn site than our control sites, but there may be other factors at play as well. Other papers have shown that this species is less common in more open habitats where there's potentially more competing snake species, including species that may eat this species, such as the king snake. One of our most commonly captured lizards, and one that's often associated with heavily burned environments and has been studied pretty heavily, is the eastern fence lizard. We saw a significant effective treatment for this species as well, and that difference was much more pronounced those first 2 years following the fire, which suggests that perhaps the microhabitats preferred by the species were more prevalent during those first 2 years after the fire, as we saw that difference kind of peter out when we look later in the study. When we look at our little brown skink, this is one of our smallest species. This is our smallest species of lizard in the eastern U.S. We saw no significant effective treatment, and the abundances were kind of differing between years. This suggests that we don't quite know what's driving the species. We saw that it's correlated with litter depth in other studies than ours, yet we didn't see much of an actual response until 6 years after the fire with more of the litter depth in the control. So the species needs more research done on it, and it's quite an interesting little facet of this community. Now, the toads. So LBL has two species of toad. We have our America toad and our Fowler's toad, and I'm sure most of you couldn't tell me which one is which. And we had some difficulties with IDing these species in the field, so we combined both of them for these analyses. We saw a significant effect of treatment with higher abundances in our controls, and that was largely driven potentially by this large spike in 2015. This is kind of surprising. Both these species are known to inhabit dry upland habitats such as grasslands and xeric pine forests. So it was kind of surprising to see that there are higher abundances in our control. So it suggests that there may be other extrinsic factors we didn't quite measure that may be impacting these, such as the availability of high-quality breeding sites. Some of our control sites were located near more permanent creeks, which may have had wetlands around them that supported breeding populations of these species. Because when we look at another aquatic breeding amphibian, we saw an opposite trend. So this is our green frog. They're a common pond breeding species of amphibian. We saw significant effective treatment for the species as well, with higher abundances in our burn than our control. This may be due to the positioning of these man-made ponds we have at LBL. Most of these man-made ponds are kind of near our burn sites rather than our control sites, and that may be a factor in why we're seeing higher abundances. And this also tells us that the impacts of the burn are not negatively impacting this species, which suggests that the toads, which are much more desiccation resistant than this species, that result may not have been resulting from actual habitat changes. Another animal, the last amphibian I'm going to talk to you guys about is the Plethodon glutinosus, or slimy salamander. So this one is of the group that is a common concern when we're applying these land management techniques that will kind of reduce their moist, humid microhabitats. We saw significant effective treatment for this species as well. What we saw was that it had similar abundances in our first 2 years after the fire, and that it was much higher in abundance than our control sites 5 and 6 years after the fire. There's a study done in Missouri that kind of suggests why we might be seeing this. So they tracked these salamanders before and after a fire, and they showed that this species group will move around more following a fire, potentially due to the lack of its preferred microhabitats. So what we might be seeing these first 2 years after the fire is animals in those burn sites are kind of responding to the fire by moving around more, trying to find a place that makes them happy, and they might potentially be stressed out, might not have gotten the chance to breed as much, so that's why we're seeing these reduced abundances 5 and 6 years post the fire. This is backed up by our cover board data for 2016. We found much more of these animals under our control cover boards and our burn cover boards, suggesting that this may be a true impact on this species. So that was a lot of stuff. Hopefully you guys got something out of it, but here's our summary. The application of the 2 prescribed fires created a minor habitat and vegetational structure gradient between our treatments. We saw reptile diversity was higher in our burned areas, and that our reptile communities were appearing to shift due to these prescribed fires, yet they were not significantly different, but they were correlating with the habitat structural changes, which suggests that these habitat structural changes are impacting the community composition of these groups, of the reptile groups. We found that amphibian communities are more dependent on year than treatment. This is not too surprising. These populations probably fluctuate pretty heavily, and most of the animals we were catching, especially with those anurans, so those toads and those frogs, were juveniles. And these Texas-specific responses are driving these community shifts. So I gave you guys some examples of some positive and negative and neutrals. I have plenty more of each type, but in the interest of time, that's what I have for you guys. And with that, I'll take any questions.
So is there anything in the literature about other groups, like the megafauna, how they could keep the disturbance down, or maybe like the invertebrate communities that would serve as prey items for these things? So have you got into other groups besides that, and how the fires affect those?
So invertebrate groups, they tend to increase depending on what group we're looking at, of course. But you're going to see more grasshoppers in a grassland and that kind of stuff. So it suggests that different habitat types will impact the different invertebrate groups, which potentially feed these animals. Because lepidopterans, orthopterans might be an important food group that's more available in these more grassy areas. For the megafauna stuff, it's hard to say. Grazing is a major concern in certain areas, but there's really not enough grazing stock in our sites to kind of say whether or not that would help. Megafauna such as elephants and stuff, it's hard to quantify what they would be doing.
Well, because historically there were buffalo on LBL, so during in those intermediate periods, they would serve to kind of maintain that
Right.
habitat structure.
Yeah,
over
so
time,
having the megafauna grazers would probably help maintain it by, well, the bison I think mostly eat grass, but things like elk and would help by eating down some of those woody stems and stuff. So it's not, I don't think it's well known how they would impact our eastern systems as well as it is like the tall grass prairie and stuff. But fire was still a major part of the component, at least for when we think about when the Native Americans were here. But they were probably playing a major role in impacting the systems.
You indicated that the burns occurred early on and then never occurred again. Is that right?
That is correct.
Does it suggest that they should continue to burn, or just one
Yes.
burn?
So what we saw was that the community didn't really shift majorly due to the 2 prescribed fires. We didn't see a very drastic vegetational response either. So we never really achieved an oak woodland and oak savanna. So if LBL, so actually I meant to talk about this too. So this is a picture of another part of LBL where they've done some reclamation logging. And as you see, there's much more sunlight reaching the ground. We see a lot more grass and foregrowth. So it suggests that if they want to quickly restore these woodland grassland ecosystems, they're going to need to do more than just apply 2 fires and walk away. They had been talking about applying fire to this site again, and that was the goal. The goal was to burn this on a 3-year regime, but they've had some difficulties, especially with the surrounding public. Burning the fire, burning the animals.
In determining the quote-unquote natural burn regime, I kind of wonder, should we be referring to that as the natural burn regime? Because that's determined right by looking at fire scars and things like that on the trees.
Yeah, so that's a major part of it, and the fire scars and historical pollen in the soils.
Right.
So it's kind of hard to determine what is a natural fire regime. When we think about fire on these ecosystems, a lot of them might have been started by the Native Americans who managed the land by using fire, which helped shape what we see in our systems, or what we would historically have seen when the Europeans arrived. That's a major philosophical debate that there's a lot of content about. But that map I showed you is kind of based on all the available data. They have applied a modeling scheme to that. But what we are seeing is that species that we would consider native to our area are blinking out and disappearing because of the lack of these open habitat structures. So if it comes down to, do we want to manage for that biodiversity, or do we kind of just want to let it sit and turn into a kind of a boring forest, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I understand. It just seems it's a little more intellectually honest to say that we're going to create a mosaic of habitat types using fire as a tool to do that, than to say that we're really recreating what naturally occurred. Because I think that is a little question.
Well, recreating what naturally occurred here would involve the megafauna, would involve apex carnivores, and that kind of stuff is not easy to recreate, especially with the fact that the government's doing this and the government requires public input. And the public doesn't seem to want red wolves on LBL, and the states don't want the elk and bison to be released. So here we are.
Following up just a little bit on that idea, that one of the things you notice when you drive around LBL is there are these old furnaces.
Mm-hmm.
And those furnaces, I believe, were used for iron production.
Right.
And they consumed a tremendous amount of wood.
Yeah.
Which would suggest that the area had a lot of wood, and maybe it wasn't as open as you might be suggesting, or was it more downslope, or what's the deal there? You have these structures that required a tremendous amount of wood, but we're talking about an open oak savanna environment.
So LBL is highly dissected. Like, you see all these ridge tops. So we would have a mosaic from the ridge tops might have supported more of what we would consider a grassland savanna, going into a woodland, going into those bottomland forests. So we had a mosaic of forest types, but on these ridge tops we would definitely have seen, well, we believe we would definitely have seen based on pollen data and other things, than the presence of these prairie species, what was historically a grassland up there. LBL was basically, they cut every tree. There's almost no old growth forest on LBL. Everything is about 80, 90 years old. So what we're seeing now is just a regeneration of what was either the stumps that were cut or just the new stuff that has grown there. So it would have been a mosaic more than.
So the effect then, over time, has been more of a homogenization of the entire area as opposed to a more mosaic type.
Right, and that's what we're worried about. Still has some of those more, like if you look at like the power line cuts, we see more of what the native cover could have potentially been as well.
Hey, Steve, I was thinking about some of the species that you had up there. Can you jump back to your slimy salamander for a second? So it seems to me that there seems to be an erosion of, so it's more than just the treatment here, but there's an erosion based off of years. So there's an interaction of year.
Yeah.
Here at the same time that you don't see in your control per se, except in 2015. But it seems to me that you have some lag effects.
That could be, so for the treatment, like that's potentially what we're thinking here, is that what we saw those first 2 years was kind of the animals responding to the change, and since these are passive traps, it's going to, like, their activity patterns are going to impact what we're catching, so they might have been moving around more, so that's why we were catching so many, and then what we're seeing is that lag effect. The low controls in the 2015 might have been due to the sampling done that year.
But this p-value here is not indicative of that lag effect. P-value is indicative of.
Right, we had a significant year effect too for most of these things.
But the year effect doesn't necessarily take into account that there's a decrease per se. There's an additional, I think, parameter there that perhaps would include that, which is the actual lag effect. Not only just the year-to-year effect, because that just takes in that there's differences between years.
Right.
But you have a trajectory on the years there, which is a lag effect.
Yeah, that's potentially something we should look at more, but it would also be helpful to have more data, especially for these 2 middle years. So.
Intense graduates.
Any more questions? Okay, thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Good luck, Steve.
You're gonna need it.
Oh, that's what we do.
What time are we meeting?
Well, originally we had scheduled like for 1.
Do you have
Job,
our
man.
You want to
our
I have
test time yet?
Who's got a thing?
I think we're at 3.
Yeah. Did we do good?
Good luck on your test. That's what I'll need.
My first one? Yeah.
Thank you.
1 o'clock's fine. Break. I'll take a potty, grab some.
George Steve.
I brought some sandwiches.
Good deal.